Some truths were never meant to be uncovered, and yet here you are, about to hear one. In the dim corridors of American history lies a story so revolting, so carefully hidden, that even the church sealed its records and the courts buried its files. It is the tale of the Greystone family, a dynasty whose legacy was built not on wealth or honor, but on something forbidden. A daughter who was raised not as a child of innocence, but as a bride in waiting. She became both daughter and wife. The name Greystone still lingers like a shadow in the records of Virginia, whispered but never spoken in full. Tonight, I'm going to drag you into that shadow. But before we begin, I want you to do something for me. Like this video, share it with someone who can stomach the truth, and subscribe to DeadScroll, because what you're about to hear has been kept from you for over 200 years. And let me ask you this directly. Where are you watching this from? Comment below your state, your city, your place in this world, because by the time this story is finished, you will see your own home differently. Imagine this, 1784. The tobacco fields of Virginia roll out like endless green seas. The Greystone estate, to the public, is a picture of piety and refinement. Polished windows, candlelit dinners, Sunday prayers that echoed with the appearance of virtue. But beneath that mask, behind locked doors, a very different ritual was unfolding. The patriarch of the Greystone family, a man described in old letters as possessed of steel eyes and unbreakable authority, believed he had been given a command older than law itself, to preserve his bloodline at all costs. To him, marriage was not about love, nor alliances, nor even survival. It was about purity of control. The Greystone archives, smuggled out of a courthouse basement more than a century later, tell us that one winter's night, after a carriage accident, a girl named Eleanor was brought into the estate. She was an orphan, fragile, vulnerable, and in need of protection. But to Jonathan Greystone, she was not a child to be safeguarded. She was a vessel, a future, an inheritance that would never leave the grasp of his name. And here is the detail they tried to erase. When Eleanor turned 16, she was no longer spoken of as his ward. The letters shift. The language changes. She is described not as daughter, but as wife. The weight of this revelation alone would have destroyed reputations, burned churches to the ground, and ended dynasties. Which is why, for centuries, every attempt was made to bury it. But the records still breathe. And when you read them closely, they reveal a deeper corruption, one that hints the Greystones were not the only family who followed this path. Tell me, if one family's forbidden bond could be hidden for so long, what else has been buried beneath the smiling mask of history? The year was 1784, and the United States was still young, its foundations barely settled, its ideals still fragile. But behind the patriotic hymns and speeches of liberty, the wealthy elite of Virginia lived by different laws. Laws they wrote for themselves, rules that bent whenever power demanded it. The Greystone estate stood as a fortress of that hypocrisy. Outwardly, they were patrons of the church, donors to the courthouse, protectors of their land. Their tobacco brought wealth that reached across the Atlantic, buying them a reputation of honor. But reputation is only what the public is allowed to see. The reality was darker. Jonathan Greystone, patriarch, widower, and master of his estate, had no intention of surrendering his power to time or to the dilution of bloodlines through marriage into rival families. He had seen too many dynasties splinter, too many fortunes divided. To him, family was not love. Family was empire, and empire demanded sacrifice. The letters that survived, some hidden in the binding of old ledgers, others tucked into the hollow backs of portrait frames, reveal a man obsessed with a singular commandment, one he claimed had been whispered down through generations: keep the blood pure, keep the name unbroken. He called it not sin, but duty. And it was under this warped vision that young Eleanor, the orphan child taken into his care, became something more than a ward. She became the solution to his legacy. Witnesses who later dared to testify spoke of locked wings in the estate, rooms no servant was allowed to enter, and dinners where Eleanor sat at Jonathan's side, not as a daughter, but as something disturbingly closer. They described a girl groomed with the education of a lady, but also trained with the silence of a wife. By 16, she no longer called him father. The household records began listing her as Lady Greystone. The church tried to suppress it. The courts sealed the files, and the surviving family fled when whispers began to spread. But before the Greystones vanished, something had already taken root, something larger than one family's corruption. The Greystones' secret was not isolated. It was connected to a network of powerful men who believed that law, morality, and even God himself were malleable tools to serve their bloodlines. And if that network still breathes today, what does that mean about the world you live in and the institutions you trust? To understand the depth of the Greystone corruption, you have to see beyond one man's obsession. You have to recognize how institutions themselves became accomplices, how silence was purchased, how morality bent under the weight of gold and land. Because Jonathan Greystone was not acting alone. His forbidden bond with Eleanor was tolerated, shielded, even protected by those who should have destroyed him. Consider the local church. Sermons thundered about sin and virtue, yet the Greystones were praised from a pulpit. Their pew remained polished, their name inscribed in the donation books, their reputation guarded like holy relics. Priests dined at their table, drank their wine, and turned their eyes from the truth whispered by servants in the shadows. For the church, condemning Jonathan would mean condemning the wealth that kept their doors open. So, they sanctified his sins with silence. Then there were the courts. In 1789, when rumors finally erupted into scandal, 23 witnesses came forward. Their testimonies, preserved in fragile handwriting, described nights of locked doors, documents forged to change Eleanor's age, and a ceremony that blurred the line between guardianship and marriage. 3 judges recused themselves, claiming moral inability to preside over what they called an abomination. But what happened to those records? Sealed, hidden for centuries. Not destroyed, no, hidden as if one day someone might need to remember. And perhaps the most chilling element is this: Eleanor herself. The letters suggest she was neither completely victim nor fully free. She was trapped in a world where dependency was manipulated, where protection was twisted into control. The writings from her hand, shaky, uneven, reveal a young woman torn between love, fear, and indoctrination. She called Jonathan my father, my master, my husband. 3 words that should never exist together. Yet in her letters they bleed onto the page as though they were natural. Why would any society allow such a grotesque arrangement to remain buried? Because the Greystone family was not unique. They were a mirror. Exposing them would risk exposing others. Powerful names, old names, families whose descendants still sit in boardrooms, churches, and political offices today. So I ask you, if the Greystone bond was sealed away to protect the powerful of their time, how many other scandals, how many other forbidden unions still lie buried in the archives you'll never be allowed to see? The true horror of the Greystone family does not rest only in what was done, but in how it was justified. Jonathan Greystone did not see himself as a criminal. In his own writings, preserved in fragments, he painted himself as a man chosen to carry out a sacred obligation. He spoke of destiny, of ancestral vows, of a covenant older than the Republic itself. And if his words are to be believed, he was not the first in his bloodline to obey this command. Hidden in the estate cellar was a chest of letters written by his grandfather, Henry Greystone, a colonist whose hand shaped the estate during the early 1700s. These letters carried instructions. Let the Greystone name never be divided. Let the Greystone blood never be diluted. What others call unnatural, we call eternal. The handwriting trembled with age, but the intent was as clear as any decree from a king. Jonathan, already consumed by ambition, interpreted these letters as law. What others would call a perversion, he called preservation. And here lies the corruption, not one man's madness, but a system of belief passed down like scripture. A belief that wealth and blood were to be guarded not just against enemies, but against time itself. The plantation workers whispered of a Greystone curse, not as superstition, but as recognition of the sinister bond between master and heir. For every fortune built in the South, there was always a secret, a crack beneath the polished veneer. But the Greystone crack was wider, darker, and it consumed anyone who entered its halls. The records show Eleanor's transition from child to wife was no sudden act, but a long calculation. She was dressed as a daughter for the public, schooled like a lady of society, yet groomed in secrecy for something far more grotesque. By the time she turned 16, she was too deep within the Greystone walls to escape. Letters from servants describe her walking the estate grounds at night, whispering prayers into the wind, as though even God had turned his face away. Yet Jonathan Greystone believed himself righteous. He believed history would remember him not as a monster, but as a patriarch who obeyed a command older than any church or state. And perhaps that is why the institutions of his time did not destroy him, because in their own hidden ways, they shared his vision. The question is, if one family could cloak their corruption beneath virtue so completely, how many others carried the same darkness, undetected, unpunished, and still alive in the bloodlines of power today? The villagers who still whisper about Ashbourne's vanished lady speak of one peculiar thing, that her disappearance left the town in a kind of suspended dread, as though time itself refused to move forward. The house where she lived with her wealthy husband, Sir Alastair, stands like a frozen monument, its halls echoing with absence, its shutters clinging to the wind like fearful eyes that refuse to shut. On the night she vanished, there were no cries, no witnesses, no disturbance of any kind. Her bed was neatly made, her jewelry locked away, and her diaries, meticulously kept for years, were missing, as though they had walked away with her. What troubled the townsfolk most was not merely that a woman had disappeared, but that she was seen that very night by two separate families. One swore they saw her walking barefoot by the river, pale and silent, as if entranced by something only she could see. Another claimed they saw her staring from her own bedroom window hours later, her face lit faintly by candlelight, though the servants swore the room was empty. Both cannot be true, and yet both accounts were delivered with trembling certainty. Theories began to spread, the kind only whispered behind locked doors. Some said Sir Alastair had grown tired of his wife and rid himself of her with a cunning so precise that not even the constables could find a shred of proof. Others claimed she had discovered something terrible about his fortune, something tied to men whose wealth came not from trade or land, but from dealings best left unspoken. Yet there were older, darker voices in Ashbourne who did not blame Sir Alastair at all. They spoke of the Hollow, a stretch of tangled woods on the estate's edge, where people claimed to hear music without instruments, voices without bodies, and footsteps that trailed behind but never ahead. Those who entered the Hollow at night were said to vanish, drawn into something that demanded silence, secrecy, and sacrifice. Could it be that the Lady of Ashbourne did not vanish by man's hand, but by something far older, far hungrier? The Corbin family ruled not through elected office or public decree, but through something far more insidious: ownership of silence. Their wealth was not measured in acres or gold, but in the obedience of those who feared them. From coal miners to school teachers, from church elders to constables, everyone in Blackvale knew their place beneath the Corbin name. And if someone forgot their place, they were quickly reminded, through disappearance, through disgrace, or through sudden ruin that no one dared to question. What outsiders never understood was how complete their control truly was. Blackvale's institutions were not separate from the Corbins. They were the Corbins. The town's only bank was run by a cousin. The church was overseen by a brother. The sheriff was a nephew. Even the local physician owed his practice to the family's patronage. To live in Blackvale was to live within their web, where every thread led back to the same poisonous center. There were stories, whispered by traveling salesmen who never stayed long, that the family maintained a ledger, not of money, but of lives. A carefully written account of who owed them loyalty, who was marked for ruin, and who had been erased altogether. Some said this ledger was passed down through generations, an heirloom of control, updated with names and dates like a farmer might record livestock. But this kind of domination came with a darker currency. People began to notice that misfortune in Blackvale was never random. A man who spoke ill of the Corbins would soon suffer a sudden injury that kept him from work. A woman who questioned the family in church would lose her home to unexpected deaths. And when entire households vanished overnight, leaving plates of food still warm on the table, the whispers grew louder. The Corbins had decided. Their reach extended beyond economics and politics into the realm of fear itself. Even the landscape seemed to conspire with them. Blackvale was surrounded by woods so thick that outsiders rarely came through, and those who entered often found themselves hopelessly lost, as if the trees themselves were protecting a secret. Locals believed the family knew paths through the forest that no one else could follow, paths that led to places no map would ever show. It was in these woods, some said, that the family performed their true work. Not the running of a town, not the managing of fortunes, but something older, something that tied them to forces deeper than wealth or blood. And if you listen closely, even now, you might hear the echo of voices carried on the wind. Prayers not meant for God, but for something that has watched over the Corbins for centuries. The Hollow Creek community had always preached a message of salvation, a doctrine built upon suffering, sacrifice, and obedience. Outsiders who visited described their sermons as strange, more like chants than spoken words. They spoke in unison, in a tone too uniform, too rehearsed, as if rehearsing an ancient spell. Every Sunday, the congregation filled their wooden chapel, lit only by candles, the air thick with incense, and the sound of their voices rising in a rhythm that seemed to echo long after the service ended. There were no children's voices heard, only the low chorus of men and women chanting as if bound by something greater than themselves. And yet, no records exist of who their preacher truly was. Some reports claim the community had no leader, that they all spoke under one voice, guided by what they called the will. But other whispers say there was someone hidden, never seen by outsiders, who dictated their every move, a figure no one dared to name. It was in these sermons that many believe the disappearances began. Travelers who wandered into the chapel out of curiosity were welcomed, offered bread, wine, and a bed for the night. Few were ever seen again. For decades, families sent letters to the authorities, pleading for help, describing their lost relatives' last known movements, each one leading back to Hollow Creek. Farmers passing through, young women searching for work, men who came to trade, all vanished. But the local sheriff's office dismissed the claims, labeling Hollow Creek as a self-sustaining private community. Some officers even warned families to stop asking questions, as if the community had protection higher than the law itself. And this is where the true horror begins, not just in the disappearances, but in the silence of those who should have acted. The Hollow Creek community operated with impunity, protected by an invisible hand, allowed to flourish while hundreds of lives quietly dissolved into nothing. Imagine standing at the edge of their land, staring at the chapel's wooden doors. Behind them, dozens of eyes fixed on you, chanting words you don't understand, their voices blending into a sound that claws at your nerves. Would you step forward, or would you run before the doors closed behind you forever? These sermons were not mere rituals. They were traps, designed to lure the lost and the curious. And once you entered their circle, once you sat in their pews, there was no turning back. Something inside Hollow Creek held you, and it did not let go. The investigation into Elias Renmore's condition took a far darker turn when doctors discovered something that defied the very foundations of their science. Elias's body was not only rejecting ordinary nourishment, it seemed to sustain itself in intervals that no medical explanation could justify. He could go days, sometimes weeks, without food, yet his body never weakened in the way a normal child's would. When the attending physician, Dr. Morton Hale, attempted to draw his blood for testing, the liquid that flowed was not entirely red, but tinged with a strange darkness, thicker, almost oil-like in consistency. Witnesses whispered that it gleamed under candlelight, as though it carried within it something ancient and unnatural. The tests conducted with this blood produced results so chaotic that most physicians destroyed their notes. Some spoke of reactions that resembled metals. Others claimed the samples seemed to move on their own, as though alive. This was not illness. This was something else, something that should not exist. The authorities, fearful of what the public might say, ordered that Elias's condition remain strictly confidential. His parents, now worn thin with dread, begged for answers that science itself refused to provide. But instead of clarity, they received warnings. Keep silent, remain obedient, and never let word escape of what lived inside their son. Yet the Renmorays were not the only ones aware of Elias's strangeness. Whispers spread through Raven Shade, hushed and trembling, carried by those who had seen the boy's pale eyes gleam in ways that no child's eyes should. Rumors circulated that Elias could stop clocks merely by passing through a room, that fires burned lower when he lingered near, and that animals recoiled in terror at his presence. Some called him cursed. Others went further, claiming that Elias was not born of this earth at all. By late 1873, the small town was divided between those who feared Elias as a harbinger of doom and those who saw him as a potential miracle, a living key to forbidden knowledge. Secret gatherings were held in candlelit barns and abandoned chapels, where whispers of prophecy painted Elias as a chosen vessel. The idea that one boy could unravel centuries of doctrine both horrified and intoxicated those who heard it. Yet, in the shadows of these meetings, there were darker forces at play. Elias was being watched, not only by doctors and townsfolk, but by organizations far older and far more powerful than any local authority. Organizations that knew exactly what he was, because they had seen it before. The Chamberlain dynasty did not just thrive on its land. It expanded outward, pulling smaller families into its orbit like a black hole consuming stars. Tenant farmers, laborers, and freedmen who came seeking stability often found themselves chained to debt contracts so cruel they rivaled slavery itself. The Chamberlains called it indentured arrangement. The law called it binding service. But the victims called it what it truly was, bondage with no escape. Generations of men broke their backs in the cotton fields, their sweat soaking the red Tennessee soil, while the Chamberlains grew fatter, prouder, and more untouchable. Each family under their control was stripped not only of wealth, but of dignity. When debts piled up and families couldn't pay, the Chamberlains claimed collateral, land, tools, and in some cases their children. Records from the county courthouse revealed chilling exchanges. Boys of 12 loaned for work, girls of 13 taken into the care of the Chamberlain household. No one dared to question, because to question was to disappear. Yet whispers always traveled. The wives of neighboring farmers spoke in hushed voices about the Chamberlains' gatherings. Strange nights when no work was done, no cotton was ginned, and all the torches in the fields burned bright as if the family were performing some ritual of power. It was said that Isaac Chamberlain, the patriarch of the dynasty, had once declared that the earth itself owed them tribute. To him, the buried bodies beneath their fields were not horrors to hide, but sacrifices to strengthen the roots of their empire. It is no accident that in 1863, while Tennessee reeled from the pressures of the Civil War, the Chamberlains' cotton exports doubled. They sold to whoever paid, Union or Confederate, cloaking themselves in neutrality while amassing fortune from every side. The blood of the nation's war was their greatest harvest, and it was in those years, when records of deaths and disappearances were at their peak, that the Chamberlains built the great house that still stands in fragments today, a mansion of blackened wood and looming columns, erected directly over the unmarked graves. Every plank, every stone of that mansion was rumored to be cursed. Carpenters vanished. Bricks were found smeared with blood before being laid. And at night, workers swore they heard muffled cries beneath the ground, as if the soil itself resisted being sealed away. But the Chamberlains smiled. For them, it was not a house. It was a monument to power built on silence. But as the final beams of daylight were strangled by the storm clouds over Raven Shade, the whispers took on a form more tangible than imagination. It was not just that children claimed to see shadows moving in the fields, or that mothers insisted their infants cried at the same hour each night. It was the sudden, unexplainable physical decay of the land itself. Crops, once tall and full, blackened and collapsed into rot within days of planting. Wells that had been pure for decades turned brackish overnight, the water thick, leaving behind a bitter metallic taste on the tongue. The livestock, creatures that once sustained the Blackthorn farm, refused to cross certain parts of the land, pulling violently on ropes, neighing and bellowing as if an invisible predator crouched at the edge of the fields. Those who forced their animals into these forbidden zones often found them dead the following morning, their eyes wide open, bodies stiffened, as though terror itself had killed them. This was no ordinary misfortune. The town physician, Dr. Erasmus Hallow, recorded in his private journal that he believed the very soil beneath the Blackthorn homestead was infected, not with disease, but with something older, something intangible. A curse of the earth, he wrote, though he dared not voice these words in the church for fear of exile. And yet, the records he left behind still send chills through anyone who reads them. He spoke of nights where he would hear chanting, not from the chapel, but from the very winds, carrying a tongue that no scripture he knew could decipher. Worse still, on one storm-choked evening, he swore he saw what looked like children, scores of them, walking across the fields of the Blackthorn land, each holding a small light in their hands, though no flame ever flickered. When he ran toward them, the field was empty, but the air smelled of sulfur and smoke. The Blackthorns, in the midst of this encroaching horror, did not withdraw. They did not flee, as many families might have. They remained, clinging to the land as though bound by some unseen pact. Their voices, once respected, became harsh and secretive, muttering to one another at the edges of town meetings, whispering in ways that seemed rehearsed. What unnerved the townsfolk most was not just their silence about the events, but their calm endurance of them, as if they had known this storm was coming, and worse, as if they had accepted it. And in Raven Shade, the whispers began to take shape, that the Blackthorn family was not a victim of some ancient curse, but the very keeper of it. The investigation into Briarvale's hidden history took a darker turn when whispers emerged from within the ruins themselves. Locals claimed that anyone who dared to spend the night near the inn heard voices, soft, almost tender, as though women were welcoming strangers into their care. But beneath that false warmth was a chilling undertone, a resonance that suggested not comfort but entrapment. These spectral murmurs seemed to echo the fates of the 43 who never left the ground alive. Even hardened men from Blackvale, men who mocked superstition, returned pale and trembling, insisting they had heard promises of eternal love whispered directly into their ears. The sisters Belladas, once thought to be grieving innkeepers mourning their lost father, were now painted by rumor as orchestrators of something unspeakable, luring visitors not to rest but to their graves. The psychology behind such a lure cannot be ignored. To prey upon the traveler's deepest need, safety in the unknown, warmth in the cold, companionship in solitude, was a manipulation of the most primal kind. Historians who revisited the case argued that the sisters exploited this vulnerability deliberately, disguising malice with tenderness. This duality, the mask of love hiding the machinery of death, is what makes Briarfield not just a crime scene, but a symbol of something older, a ritual of hospitality twisted into an unholy contract. Some scholars suggested connections to ancient rites, where visitors to sacred spaces were offered shelter, only to be sacrificed beneath the guise of generosity. If the sisters were acting under such influences, Briarvale was not merely the site of murders, but of ritualized devotion to something unseen. As documents surfaced from the convent where the sisters were raised, details grew darker. Records hinted at punishments designed to test the soul through pain, exercises of obedience that blurred the line between love and torment. Could this distorted upbringing have shaped the way they saw death? Perhaps, in their minds, they were not killing. They were offering passage, transforming strangers into eternal companions bound to the land forever. The chilling thought is that they may have believed they were saving their victims. And here lies the heart of Briarvale's terror. Love corrupted into control, hospitality transformed into horror. The graves at Briarfield were not random. They were chosen, layered, and marked in silence. Each stone was both a memorial and a secret. And as more was unearthed, it became clear that the sisters Belladez did not act as lone monsters in the dark. They represented an inheritance, a system of belief buried so deep it poisoned everything it touched. The silence that followed Samuel's declaration was almost unbearable. For a long moment, no one moved. The air in the chamber felt charged, as though some invisible weight had dropped upon the room. His mother trembled, clutching the fabric of her dress so tightly that her knuckles turned white. His father's stern composure cracked, revealing the faintest trace of doubt. Was this the moment where fear finally began to outweigh loyalty? The boy's voice carried with it no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was not the rambling of a child's imagination, but the calculated speech of someone, or something, that had known truth from before his birth. Samuel's words cut deeper than Scripture itself. He claimed to remember lands that no map could name, skies with constellations unknown to men, and voices that had spoken to him before he ever entered his mother's womb. He spoke of rivers flowing upward, of a sun that bled instead of shone, and of a city where the dead walked freely among the living, exchanging secrets forbidden to mankind. These are not things that could be taught or imagined by a boy of 7. They were recollections so detailed, so alien, that even the most hardened skeptic struggled to dismiss them. One of the elders present fell to his knees, muttering prayers of protection, convinced that Samuel had been possessed. Another clutched the crucifix around his neck, as if it might shatter under the weight of the revelation. But Samuel himself did not tremble. He did not cry or show fear. His eyes, those cold, endless eyes, only grew sharper, darker, as though each word spoken gave him strength. He spoke as if his soul belonged elsewhere, and this body was only a borrowed vessel. What unnerved the witnesses most was not just what he said, but how he said it. Samuel's voice was calm, almost serene, carrying the tone of someone remembering rather than imagining. There was no struggle in his speech, no searching for words, only the effortless recall of memories no child should have. And when he finally fell silent, the room itself seemed to recoil. In that silence, the family's future began to fracture. Samuel's parents were forced to face the unbearable truth. Either their son was touched by forces too great for the human mind, or he was not their son at all. In the days that followed, the villagers whispered of curses and old debts paid in blood. Rumors spread that the Chamberlains had angered something far older than their lineage, something rooted deep beneath Tennessee's soil. They said the land itself had claimed the children as payment for generations of cruelty. But there were others, those who had seen the Chamberlains up close, who whispered that the family's wealth wasn't simply stained with blood, but built on a pact. Some said Edward Chamberlain's grandfather had been seen speaking alone at night in the cotton fields, whispering into the shadows as if conversing with someone unseen. His fortune, so sudden and vast, had raised eyebrows. And now, with children vanishing and graves being unearthed, those suspicions no longer felt like idle gossip. As the truth crept closer, something else became undeniable. The Chamberlains were not merely protectors of wealth, but keepers of a secret buried under their land. The silence around those 73 unmarked graves was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of complicity. Every villager who had once picked cotton for them, every worker who had walked the fields at dusk, had noticed things: the muffled cries at night, the sudden disappearances, the smell of earth turned too often near the oak grove. Yet they had chosen silence, afraid of the power the Chamberlains wielded. But silence has a price, and it was now collecting its debt. The family's estate, once the envy of Tennessee, began to rot from the inside. Rooms smelled of mildew, walls sweated dampness even in summer, and footsteps echoed in hallways long thought empty. Those who stepped inside spoke of hearing faint weeping, not from one direction, but from every corner of the house at once, as if the walls themselves remembered the buried souls. The chamberlains carried on, refusing to admit what was happening, their pride shackled to their crumbling empire. But at night, when no one was watching, their lights never went out. Torches burned until dawn, as though they were terrified of what might come crawling from the shadows once the dark swallowed their estate whole. And yet, no amount of light could keep the truth buried forever. The unmarked graves whispered with a hunger, and soon the chamberlains would learn that wealth cannot silence the dead. There are few things more dangerous than a community built on secrets. What began as whispers in Hollow Creek had by now taken the shape of something far more sinister. An institution of silence, an unspoken agreement among the residents. They knew what they were a part of, even if no one dared to say it aloud. Outsiders had tried to dig into the disappearances, but they quickly realized the resistance wasn't just from the religious leaders. It came from the entire town. Shopkeepers looked away, neighbors gave vague answers, and those who pried too deeply were either driven out or ended up missing themselves. This was not just a religious order hiding the truth. It was a system of control, one that reached into every home, every family, every aspect of life in Hollow Creek. The frightening part wasn't just that people disappeared, it was how normal it became. After years of this cycle, the idea of vanishing was treated almost as an inheritance, a shadow passed down from one generation to the next. People buried their suspicions deep inside, hoping that silence would keep them safe. But history has proven time and time again that silence does not protect. It only feeds the darkness, allowing it to grow until it becomes untouchable. Those who escaped Hollow Creek carried scars that couldn't be erased. Survivors spoke of rituals that stripped people of their names and replaced them with numbers. They spoke of a doctrine where suffering was worshipped, where obedience meant erasing yourself completely. The chilling detail? Many of these testimonies never reached the public eye, silenced by institutions larger than Hollow Creek itself. This wasn't just the corruption of a small town. It was a system that benefited from keeping the truth buried. Think about it. 312 people vanished in less than 3 decades, and yet no federal investigation fully penetrated Hollow Creek. That silence didn't happen by accident. It happened because someone, somewhere, had something to gain from keeping the truth hidden. And the question you have to ask yourself is this. If a community could conceal so much horror for so long, what other secrets, larger, older, and far more terrifying, are still being hidden in plain sight? The story of Hollow Creek isn't just about a vanished community. It's about the machinery of silence, the systems built to protect the guilty and erase the innocent. And it's about what happens when that machinery grows so powerful, it begins to rewrite reality itself. But the deeper we go, the more the story begins to corrode itself. Records conflict, testimonies warp. The truth becomes less about what happened and more about what was allowed to be remembered. Documents concerning the Orval disappearances were allegedly locked inside diocesan archives, only accessible to bishops. Yet whispers claim that some of those archives were burned entirely under the guise of reorganization. Why would a church destroy its own history unless that history threatened its power? This is where the edges of faith and fear bleed together. Men who were once servants of God are said to have vanished from the record, reassigned to distant parishes only to fade into silence. Local officials never pressed further. Was it incompetence or complicity? The Orval villagers, silenced by intimidation, passed the story only through hushed warnings to their children. Don't linger near the convent after sunset, and never speak of what you see in its windows. These warnings outlasted fact. They replaced testimony with fear, as if fear itself were more durable than truth. And maybe that's the point. Fear is easier to maintain than evidence, because fear doesn't need proof. It festers in silence, keeps men in line, and protects those who wield it. This is the system we're forced to confront. Not just a convent, not just a scandal, but an entire network that thrives in shadows. When a story becomes too dangerous, it is buried. And when a truth threatens to expose those who rule, it is twisted into myth. The Orval case sits right on that fault line. The moment you try to dig, the ground gives way. So the question becomes, how do we separate reality from the rot deliberately sown into the archives? Was this just another isolated disappearance? Or was Orval part of something larger? An experiment in silence and submission designed to test how far control could stretch? When you look close enough, the answer feels far more chilling than either possibility. There's a saying among the old villagers of Orval: the convent did not keep secrets, the convent was the secret. And perhaps that explains why every path toward truth seems to dissolve into smoke. For decades, outsiders who attempted to investigate found themselves suddenly unwelcome. Landlords refused to rent them rooms. Letters they mailed never arrived. Local priests advised them to seek God's light elsewhere. It was as though the town itself had been trained to repel curiosity. And yet, the strangest detail remains: whispers of a ledger. A single book kept hidden by one of the convent's confessors, allegedly containing the names of those who vanished, written in his own trembling hand. If true, this ledger could have been the key to unraveling the mystery. But no trace of it has ever surfaced. Some claim it was burnt. Others believe it was stolen by a higher authority. A few whisper that it was deliberately buried in the convent's foundation, sealed in brick and mortar like a tomb for truth. Think about that for a moment. An institution built to guard the holy word may have entombed its darkest record within its very walls, ensuring that faith and fear would remain indistinguishable. And still, fragments survive. Strange reports of ritual confessions held not in the chapel, but in the cellar. Records of parish donations spiking mysteriously in the years when the disappearances occurred. Rumors of young novices admitted into the order and then never seen again. These scraps form no perfect picture, but perhaps perfection is not the point. Perhaps the fragments themselves are the warning. The ledger may never be found. The truth may remain sealed, but the story survives in whispers because silence itself cannot erase dread. If anything, it amplifies it. And so we must ask, if the convent buried its truth, what else has been buried across Europe, across centuries? How many more Orvals have been sealed off? Not because they were irrelevant, but because they were too revealing. What if this is not the only ledger we are meant never to read? Imagine a silence, so carefully crafted it begins to feel holy. That is what the Orval convent perfected, a silence mistaken for piety. But behind that silence, a pattern reveals itself, one that stretches far beyond a single convent. Across Europe in the 19th century, there are scattered reports of religious houses where records mysteriously vanish, where visiting bishops suddenly cut inspections short, where inquiries into missing sisters are redirected toward vague answers of illness or transfer. But transfers to where? Illness with no grave? The more one examines these coincidences, the less coincidental they seem. Patterns emerge. Sudden spikes in financial donations whenever disappearances occurred, a tightening of church influence over local populations, and the uncanny way testimonies were always silenced before they reached the ears of the press. It is as if Orval was not an anomaly, but part of a larger system, an experiment in control hidden behind walls of stone and scripture. And yet, the convent's power was not only in secrecy, it was in manipulation. Witnesses describe how those who questioned the nun's absence were often drawn into confessions themselves, told that their doubt was a sin, that their questions offended God. Fear was reshaped into guilt. Inquiry was twisted into shame. The genius of the institution lay not in chains of iron, but in chains of the mind. Imagine how many lives were redirected. How many villagers kept their silence, not because they did not know, but because they had been convinced that to speak was to condemn themselves. This was psychological control at its most perfected. Now consider the possibility that the ledger, the rumored Book of Vanished Names was not destroyed at all? What if it was deliberately hidden in archives far from Orval, locked away in a Vatican vault, guarded not because it was false, but because it was true? The Church, after all, has centuries of practice in curating its own history, deciding what survives and what disappears. And if Orval was but one shadow in a much larger cathedral of darkness, then that ledger may be less a record of loss and more a mirror, reflecting the machinery of power itself. The discovery of the Hollowbrook Estate's underground tunnels changed everything. What had once been whispered folklore now became undeniable evidence. Physical proof that something unspeakable had been orchestrated beneath the family's mansion. These tunnels weren't rough or improvised. They were carefully designed, carved with purpose, and eerily symmetrical, suggesting not just secrecy, but planning, years, maybe decades of construction. But the question that unsettled every investigator was not just who built them, but why. The walls of the tunnels were smooth, etched with markings that at first looked like random scratches. But when the patterns were studied, they revealed themselves as deliberate, symbols no one could trace to any known culture or language. The Hollowbrook name was inscribed repeatedly in spirals, almost as if the family were marking their dominion, branding their identity into stone. In one chamber, rows of rusted iron chains hung from hooks. The floor bore shallow grooves, like something heavy had been dragged across it, again and again. The most disturbing find came deeper inside. A circular room, perfectly geometric, with a sunken center resembling a ritual pit. Around it, 12 alcoves cut into the stone, each containing fragments, bones, remnants of fabric, and in some cases, entire skeletons carefully arranged. The remains weren't buried. They were displayed, as though placed for ritual observation. Their positioning was deliberate, facing inward, as though they were participants in an eternal gathering. Local authorities had no framework to interpret what they found. Archaeologists were brought in, yet they disagreed violently over its significance. Some claimed it was a forgotten religious site that the Hollowbrooks inherited and concealed. Others argued the family themselves constructed it, blending wealth, secrecy, and perverse devotion into something entirely their own. But what no one could deny was this: the estate wasn't just a home. It was a structure layered with hidden intent, designed to mask a system of control, punishment, and ritual. When the findings leaked to the press, the narrative shifted. No longer was the Hollowbrook family remembered as a line of aristocrats who died tragically or mysteriously. They became synonymous with the very architecture of terror. Their name was no longer just a surname. It became a code word, whispered in the darker corners of historical societies, signifying the hidden places where the elite carried out acts never meant to be seen. And yet, even as these discoveries shocked the public, deeper truths still remained buried. The tunnels were not simply spaces of cruelty. They were messages, carved into stone, telling us something about power, secrecy, and the systems humanity builds to conceal its own nightmares. The most disturbing discovery in the surviving fragments of official documents is the contradiction they reveal. On one hand, government records from that period repeatedly referenced structural instability and collapse hazards in the Hollow Creek religious community. On the other, those same records continued to authorize gatherings of hundreds of people inside the community's primary meeting hall. It's as though the authorities were aware of a danger, but the danger wasn't simply architectural. It was social, spiritual, and perhaps even political. Why would officials tolerate gatherings in a place they themselves flagged as unsafe? Unless, of course, the danger wasn't meant to be prevented, but rather contained. Hollow Creek seemed less like a faith community and more like a living laboratory where officials allowed, and perhaps even encouraged, experiments on human belief, obedience, and psychological breakdown. The missing 312 people were not only members of a community. They may have been subjects of something far darker, something that required vanishing rather than acknowledging. If this was true, then Hollow Creek wasn't a failed religious enclave. It was a controlled experiment in silence and disappearance. The evidence suggests that the very institutions tasked with protecting people may have been the same ones that orchestrated their erasure. Those who lived on the outskirts of Hollow Creek remembered faint, unsettling details that slipped into their testimonies: fragments of sound, strange flickers of light, and moments that defied explanation. Farmers swore that at night, a hum rose from beneath the ground, vibrating through the soil like the low growl of a hidden engine. Shepherds claimed their flocks refused to graze near the boundary fence, as though some invisible current repelled them. And yet, the most haunting testimony came from children. In interviews decades later, grown men and women recalled being kept awake as children by the singing. Not church hymns, not prayers, but a low, drawn-out chorus that seemed to come from the earth itself, carrying words they could not understand but rhythms they felt in their bones. Some described the sound as a warning, others as a lure. And when the disappearances accelerated in the final decade, that singing reportedly grew louder until one night it stopped altogether. It was the same night dozens of families were never seen again. To this day, no one has explained the sound, but it remains tied to the vanishings, an auditory ghost echoing from a community that was swallowed by silence. When investigators reviewed maps of Hollow Creek, a disturbing pattern emerged. The locations tied to missing persons reports formed precise geometrical shapes, as though the community itself had been designed around an unseen order. Every vanished family, every child taken, every lone wanderer who disappeared, plotted onto paper, created a series of interlocking circles and angles resembling ancient sigils more than random placement. This pattern was not apparent until an outsider traced the vanishings with a ruler and compass. Local law enforcement dismissed it as coincidence, but mathematicians who later examined the diagrams called it too exact to be chance. Some claimed it mirrored ritualistic diagrams found in forbidden texts, symbols of containment, of summoning, of sacrifice. If true, it would mean the community was not merely struck by tragedy, but orchestrating something on a scale far beyond criminal intent. Each disappearance may not have been isolated, but deliberately placed, as though each missing soul was part of an offering arranged across the land itself. The chilling realization: Hollow Creek may have been less a village and more a living ritual, its fields and homes arranged as extensions of an ancient design. By the late 1890s, rumors about Hollow Creek had spread far beyond the region. Journalists, drawn by whispers of disappearances and strange rituals, attempted to infiltrate the community. Few ever returned. Those who did described nights filled with low, unbroken chants drifting through the woods, fires that burned in impossible colors, and figures standing in perfect stillness beneath the moon as though awaiting instructions from something unseen. One reporter wrote in his final dispatch that the townspeople's eyes did not reflect light the way they should, as if the soul had retreated inward, leaving only a vessel behind. His letter was found crumpled and bloodstained in a train station, but the man himself never boarded. The community leaders denied everything, insisting Hollow Creek was nothing more than a quiet religious settlement beset by unfair rumors. Yet every denial came with a peculiar calm, almost rehearsed, as though they had prepared for these questions centuries in advance. What unsettled investigators most was the villagers' complete lack of fear. Not of lawmen, not of outsiders, not even of death. It was as if they served something greater than the consequences of this world, and that something demanded silence. The silence of Hollow Creek was its most powerful weapon. Families of the missing who came searching often returned home broken, speaking in half-finished sentences, their memories fractured as though something had been stolen from their minds. Some insisted they had seen their lost sons or daughters standing among the congregation, alive but altered, their faces marked by a serenity that felt inhuman. Others swore the townspeople performed rituals of erasure, burying not only bodies but memories themselves, as if the past could be rewritten by collective will. Court petitions were filed, investigations launched, but every effort dissolved into confusion and bureaucracy. Records vanished, names changed, Maps subtly shifted to make Hollow Creek harder to locate. Officials who pressed too deeply suddenly resigned, suffered accidents, or disappeared altogether. It became clear that Hollow Creek was not just protected by secrecy. It was protected by something older, something with the power to bend reality itself. Outsiders began to whisper that the village had mastered the art of disappearance, not only of people, but of truth. To be why 1898, whispers of Hollow Creek's religious community had spread far beyond its borders, but always in fragmented tones, as if the story itself resisted being told. Travelers who attempted to document their experiences often destroyed their own journals, claiming the words they had written no longer belonged to them. Survivors described sermons that seemed less like worship and more like psychological conditioning. Voices layered in chants that disassembled the mind piece by piece until loyalty to the outside world dissolved. The leader's name was never consistent, sometimes called Elias, sometimes Father Thorn, sometimes only the keeper, but always described the same way: tall, severe, with eyes that glowed like lanterns in the dark. He promised freedom, yet his followers were bound tighter than prisoners. He promised eternal life, yet his flock vanished into the earth without markers or remembrance. By then, even the newspapers refused to print the stories, not out of disbelief, but out of fear. Hollow Creek had become a forbidden subject, the kind of truth that could pull entire families into silence. What disturbed investigators most was not the vanishing of 312 people, but the precision of the disappearances. No graves, no scattered belongings, no abandoned homes. Only silence, as though entire families had been erased with surgical intent. A few letters recovered from the outskirts of Hollow Creek painted a chilling picture. Mothers urging their children not to leave the compound. Fathers writing of visions in the chapel where walls seemed to breathe, where whispers slithered through cracks in the stone. One described a ritual of mirrors, where each follower was forced to stare into their own reflection until it no longer resembled them. By the time the letter was finished, the writer confessed he no longer remembered his own name. The handwriting itself degraded into an incoherent scrawl. It was as though Hollow Creek was not merely a community, but a living organism, one that consumed identity, memory, and eventually flesh. The town surrounding it feared even to speak its name, for they believed to do so was to invite the same fate. By 1911, whispers of Hollow Creek reached beyond the rural valleys and into the ears of government officials. But when investigators were sent, they reported nothing more than an empty religious community. Fields untended, houses in neat rows, doors unlocked, food still laid on tables, yet no trace of life. It was as if 300 souls had walked out together into the woods and never returned. Some said the officials deliberately suppressed what they found, sealing away files under the guise of national security. Others believed the government was complicit, that Hollow Creek had been an experiment in mass control, a hidden prototype of psychological warfare. The journals left behind mentioned a doctrine called the Great Exchange, where followers were taught that to leave the community meant forfeiting one's life, that the outside world was a graveyard for the soulless. Those who believed it stayed until the end. Those who doubted vanished first. And so the town of Hollow Creek remained, empty, waiting, its silence more terrifying than screams. The landscape around Hollow Creek grew wild in the decades that followed. Vines clawed their way over the chapel, and the once proud bell tower leaned as though bowing to something unseen. Locals who wandered too close reported strange sounds at night. Low chants, like a congregation still gathered in worship long after death. Some swore they saw pale figures standing in the fields, unmoving, staring into the distance as if waiting for orders. Farmers nearby began to lose livestock without explanation, the animals found drained, as though something ritualistic had taken place. Yet, despite the fear, the government declared Hollow Creek abandoned by natural migration, a phrase that seemed deliberately designed to dismiss suspicion. But no one migrates together in silence, leaving meals half-eaten and tools dropped mid-work. The truth remained buried in shadows, and each year the land seemed to sink deeper into itself, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow the memory of what had happened. Whispers of Hollow Creek spread beyond the county lines, drawing in outsiders, investigators, journalists, even occult enthusiasts. Some came with notebooks, others with holy symbols, but few ever returned with anything but trembling hands and fractured words. One journalist, sent in 1903, wrote a single chilling line before abandoning his work entirely. "They are not gone. They are waiting." His editor burned the notes, fearing the obsession would spread like a contagion. By now, the number, 312 vanished souls, had become less a statistic and more a curse, a number that seemed to weave its way into other disappearances across the country. Entire towns whispered of Hollow Creek in the same breath as Salem or Roanoke, but darker, less discussed, as though saying the name aloud might invoke its hunger. To this day, the silence surrounding the community is too perfect, too absolute, as if someone, something, still guards the truth with iron chains. By the dawn of the 20th century, Hollow Creek was no longer a community. It was an echo chamber of vanished lives, a hollow stage where 312 names had been erased. Families who had once prayed together, farmed together, and shared bread at long tables were now nothing more than whispers carried on the wind. Yet the strangest part wasn't their absence, but the precision of it. Every disappearance fell within a carefully measured span of 27 years, as though calculated, orchestrated by a force that understood time better than man ever could. Records unearthed decades later revealed a chilling pattern. Cycles of silence followed by cycles of vanishing, repeating in intervals that suggested ritual rather than coincidence. Scholars, priests, even physicists who dared study it agreed on only one point. Hollow Creek had not died. It had been emptied. And when something is emptied, it is usually prepared to be filled again. What truly terrifies investigators, historians, and the few survivors willing to speak is not what Hollow Creek lost, but what it might have gained. Because hidden deep in the archives of a private collector, a letter was found, dated to the very last year of the vanishings. Its words were scrawled in haste, almost unreadable, but one line burned through the paper like fire. They are not gone. They are waiting beneath. Beneath what? Beneath the soil of the abandoned farms? Beneath the collapsed chapel? Or beneath the very ground Hollow Creek still rests on, silent, rotting, abandoned? Some researchers whisper of an underground system, tunnels carved not by men, but by something else. Was Hollow Creek emptied to prepare a vessel? Were its 312 souls consumed to fuel something far older, something still stirring in the dark? The answer has never been uncovered, and maybe it was never meant to be. But if they are waiting beneath, then the question becomes chillingly simple. Waiting for what? There are stories that end with silence, and there are stories that end with blood. Hollow Creek's story ends with neither. It ends with a warning. In 1978, years after the last disappearance, two surveyors entered the land to map what remained of the community. Their notes, recovered from a briefcase found in an abandoned truck, describe something no sane man should have written. They claimed to hear chanting underground, rhythmic and low, as though hundreds of voices were speaking in unison. They said the ground trembled with every step, that the trees leaned inward like 1,000 listening sentinels. The final page is smeared with dirt and sweat, but 5 words were still legible. The 312 are not gone. If true, then Hollow Creek did not simply lose its people. It became something else, a vessel, a prison, a womb of voices that refused to die. And maybe, just maybe, their whispers are not finished yet. And so here we are, at the edge of the truth no one was ever meant to speak. Hollow Creek did not vanish. It was buried alive. The 312 who disappeared were not lost to time, but absorbed into something older, something that feeds on obedience, silence, and ritual. Governments sealed records, churches burned documents, and scientists dismissed testimonies because to admit Hollow Creek's truth is to admit that control systems, ancient, invisible, and still active, exist all around us. Every disappearance, every erased family, every forgotten grave may not be random at all, but part of the same machinery that turned Hollow Creek into a hushed scar on the map. The whispers never ended. They are only waiting for someone reckless enough to listen. And tonight you have listened. If you feel the weight of this tale pressing into your chest, then you've been marked by it. This is DeadScroll. Subscribe if you dare, because the deeper we go, the darker it gets. And remember this, when silence surrounds you, it may not be silence at all. It may be Hollow Creek still calling.